Hi everyone, my name is Aimen Gaba, and this work is done in collaboration with my co-first author, Zhanna Kaufman, and our other wonderful co-authors, Jason, Marie, Kyle, and our advisors, Yuriy, Brun, and Xiong, Bearfield. So, to set up some context, imagine you have some money that you would like to invest. You are looking for a financial advisor to invest your money for you. You find two options for financial advisors. One of them returns, on average, 30% profit, and the other returns 20%. With everything else being equal, who might you choose? The answer should be easy. You want to go with the one which returns a higher profit. Now, what if I tell you the one that returns the higher profit is sexist? Are you still going to choose them? Maybe not. Maybe that 10% less of profit is preferable since it means you don't have to work with a sexist. But what if the investor returned 15% profit instead of 20%? Are you still going to go with the other one? What if they returned 5% profit? At one point, you might no longer be willing to get less money in order to avoid a sexist. What if these are not human lenders you are dealing with, but rather machines trained on financial data that predicts the interest you deserve via some machine learning model? Which one would you choose? Machine learning models are used everywhere in the high impact domains, such as the financial domain, and quite often they are used to make decisions like how much interest to charge or even whether someone should receive a loan or not. They learn from real world data, and alongside it, the biases embedded in how decisions are made in the real world. And so we ask the question, what factors impact people's decision to decide which model to use? The degree to which it helps maximize profit, the amount of bias it exhibits, the way the model description is communicated to the decision maker, or perhaps even characteristics of the decision maker themselves, like their own race, gender, and tendency to trust. We conducted a series of studies where we asked our participants to choose one of two models to invest their money with. We varied the model's performance by changing percentage profit they returned and the average difference between the fair and biased models. We also weighed the degree to which it exhibits sexist behavior by showing model history performance to either biased men or women. And it can be super biased. For example, it can help men make 50% profit more than women, or a little biased, it helps men make 30% more profit than women. We also weighed how this historical information is communicated via bar chart or via text. And to account for the effect of participants' own gender, we presented this scenario as either the participant investing on their own behalf or on the behalf of a client whose gender identity is unknown. And so we start by asking the following research question, which is, does describing the model's history using textual descriptions and bar charts affect trust? And spoiler alert, the answer is yes. But let's zoom in on the details a bit more. This chart shows our results for the text representations and the bar representations, where the purple line represents results for text and the blue line represents results for bars. The x-axis on this chart is the difference in return of the bias model between men and women. The y-axis shows the percentage of participants who chose the fair model. Overall, you can see the purple line being above the blue line, which shows that the participants chose the fair model more often when they were presented with text as compared to bar charts. But let's zoom out on our results and show you a bigger picture. On the left, you can see the results when the bias did not favor the gender of the participants. On the right shows the results when the bias did favor the gender of the participant. You can also see the effect both when the difference between the fair and the unfair model is small and when it is large. And as you can see, we found that participants chose the fair model more often when presented with the model's history via text as compared to bar charts. And so, to reiterate our point, describing a model's history using text or bar charts does affect trust. While we showed you this bar chart and this text, the bar chart can be designed differently to look like a horizontal bar chart, or it could be a vertical bar chart with colors or a horizontal bar chart with colors. And the text could show percentage, or it could show percentage with profit, it could show percentage and compare them, or it could be directly comparing the numbers, and so on. So we wanted to know how robust is our finding. Here are some results and all the conditions we tested for your reference. We included 8 different text representations, and we found response patterns to be generally consistent within different text representations. And we included 4 different bar chart representations, and again, we found choice patterns to be largely consistent within different bar chart representations as well. In summary, we found minimal differences in participants' reactions across bar styles and text phrasing. This suggests generalizability between different variations of bar charts and text representations in impacting selection behaviors.
On to the second question. We wondered whether accuracy and fairness affect men's and women's trust differently, and we found that yes, they do. This chart shows our results for participants who identified as men and as women, where the orange line represents results for women and blue for men. You can see that the orange line is above the blue line, indicating that women chose the fair model more often. But let's zoom in on our results in a particular case where the bias model did not favor the gender of the participant. In this case, we see that the model on the left is fair, i.e. it returns an equal amount to both men and women, and the model on the right is biased and favors men, but it returns the same amount to women as the model on the left. We look at this example for each gender when the other gender is favored. This difference is especially large, with women choosing the fair model in most cases and men choosing the bias model in most cases. However, in general, when participants are disadvantaged by the biased model, they tend to choose the fair model in most cases once the fair model begins to offer a higher return than the biased model. This is not true when the bias favors their own gender. Here, men and women always tend to choose the bias model. Zooming out on our results, in all cases, and across virtually all conditions, women chose the fair model more often than men. So, in summary, we found that yes, accuracy and fairness do affect men's and women's trust differently. Next, we investigated whether model performance magnitude affects participant choices. And we found that model performance does affect trust, but slightly. We performed a between-subject study with two conditions of model performance based on the average return on investment from the fair model: a high-performance condition and a low-performance condition. In the high-performance condition, i.e. when returns are high, people are willing to care more about fairness. When returns are low, people tend to ignore the bias a little more in favor of profit. We also performed a within-subject study for both the high and low performance models with a low difference condition, where the bias model returned an average of 10 cents more per dollar than the fair model, and a high difference condition, where the bias model returned an average of 20 cents more per dollar than the fair model. We found that participants tended to trust the fair model more often in low difference conditions as compared to high difference conditions, indicating that people are more willing to care about fairness when the bias model provides less of an advantage. So in summary, we found that the model performance does affect trust, but slightly. Finally, we want to see if making a decision on one's own behalf versus on behalf of someone whose gender identity is unknown affects people's choice behaviors. And we found that yes, it does. We found that participants tolerated more bias when deciding on their own behalf than when deciding on behalf of a client. This is particularly visible when the bias favors the gender of the participant. When deciding on their own behalf, participants very rarely chose the fair model. However, when deciding on behalf of a client, they chose the fair model more often as the bias increased. As we've seen so far, the model description style, personal decision-maker characteristics, model performance, and personal stake in the scenario all affect trust in a model. Why do we observe these effects? In order to better understand our results, we looked to qualitatively identify what sort of strategies participants used when deciding which model they should trust. We randomly distributed free response questions asking for participants' reasoning throughout our surveys. After performing an inductive thematic analysis to identify strategies, we found 7 strategies that people tend to employ. I'll briefly talk about a few now. For example, the average strategy, where participants looked for the higher overall average; the delta strategy, where participants assessed differences within a model or between models and often focused on equality or fairness; the self-profit strategy, where participants chose whichever model gave them more money; the personal belief strategy, where participants utilized personal beliefs outside the scope of model descriptions. Some key observations from our analysis. We found that women chose the delta strategy more often than men did, and participants chose the delta strategy more often when presented with text than with bars. It seems that text affords difference computation, which may drive the higher frequency at which participants chose the fair model. This inference aligns with existing work on how people reason with data. Explicitly showing numbers facilitates difference computations, while visualizing values with bar charts draws people's attention to salient large values. This potentially explains why participants chose the self-profit strategy more often when presented with bar charts, and why the self-profit strategy was less predictive of choosing the fair model. So, it is clear that people exhibit biased behavior. How might we help? Well, existing work shows that warnings are one potential option. We wanted to know exactly how they would affect participant behavior in these scenarios. To answer this question, we distributed a survey with bar graph style questions designed exactly as before, but with an explicit label stating that the model was unfair. We found that yes, explicit labeling affected which model participants tended to choose. When the label was placed on the bias model, participants chose the fair model more often as compared to when there was no label on any of the models. This was true both when participants were investing on their own behalf and when they were investing on behalf of a client. But when the label was placed on the fair model, participants chose the fair model less often than when there was no label. Our results indicate that participants made decisions based on what they were textually told about the model rather than what they saw from visual model descriptions. In summary, showing warnings does help, but also raises an issue of people overly relying on the text and not paying attention to the model description. Finally, we looked to see whether any other demographics or personal characteristics were correlated with different participant choice behaviors that may be driving our results. We asked participants for the demographic information but found negligible effects across all demographics outside from gender. However, we also saw unequal distributions of participants across these demographics, so it's possible that the effect exists but is not reportable given our participant set. Participants also took an interpersonal trust survey, and we found that participants with higher trust scores chose the fair model more often. Finally, we performed a cognitive reflection test made up of 3 questions correlated with quantitative reasoning ability and found that participants with higher CRT scores chose the FAIR model less often.
To sum up our findings, I'd like to reiterate on some of the key takeaways from our talk. Number 1, women are more likely to choose fairer models than men are. Presentation of bias information influences users' trust, and explicitly telling people a model may be biased can overpower the effect of a model's biased history. So, I'd like to discuss some of the design implications of our study. Design for stakeholder relationships is very important. Number 2, consider user perspectives informed by personal characteristics. Number 3, use explicit warnings with caution. And finally, account for bias in both the design and the users. To read more about our other findings and our study methodology in detail, please read our paper. Thank you.